This situation involved about 6 of us reading from a script that X had done. Commander X1242, we need to, eject such and such hatch, and it was all this kind of jargon. And we get a little ways into it, and everybody seems to be doing fine. I think I'm doing fine, and X looks at me and says, "Rick, you're terrible at this." I said, "Well, X, I warned you." He goes, "Oh boy," So we kept going, and much to my surprise, anytime I went on Space Mountain, no matter which park it was in, I always heard myself in there. Ann would point it out to me as well. So I guess he decided differently at that point.
That is Rick Harper, director of Impressions to France, who's back to talk more about that film, plus a lot of great stories of what it was like to work with so many Imagineering legends. It's going to be fun. You're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Thanks for joining me here on episode 120 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. I am your host, Dan Heaton. Hope you had a good Halloween, even with it being so different this year. Still a way to have fun we did here at our house for sure. My girls got all dressed up and had fun even without the trick-or-treating, which is all you can really do this year, the way things are going. I am thrilled about today's episode. It was amazing to get the chance to talk once again with Rick Harper, the director of Impressions to France. He's done so much more. Rick was one of my early guests who had actually worked for Disney back in episode 61, about 2 years ago. I talked with Rick, had an amazing conversation, learned so much about his career and especially about Impressions to France. We're going to dig even further in this episode. He talks more about some of the challenges with shooting that film, given the technology they had at the time. And beyond that, he spent a good amount of time telling some great stories about working with so many Imagineering legends that were still around in the 1970s and 80s, like Harper Goff, Marty Sklar, Atencio, like you heard in that intro clip. Even Gordon Cooper, the astronaut who was involved with Disney during the time before EPCOT Center, and lots more. Rick even had a story about an unfortunate mishap while shooting at the Everglades for the speed rooms at Disneyland's People Mover. So much there, and I really appreciate that Rick was willing to come back on and talk once again. Before I get to that conversation, I just want to say thank you to the members of the Tomorrow Society through Patreon. This show is supported by all of you, and it really keeps the show going and helps me to be able to talk to just amazing guests like Rick and so many others. If you'd like to learn more about how to help support this podcast, go to tomorrowsociety.com/member, and you can find out about small monthly contributions that also give really cool perks, like the Tomorrow Society Bulletin monthly show that I do solely for members of the Tomorrow Society. It's a lot of fun. Well, I don't want to waste any more time talking now because this is a long conversation with Rick. I think it was just so much fun to do, and I love checking in with Rick once again. He's been a great friend to the show beyond just being on the podcast. Super helpful in connecting me with other guests and just being a great friend to the podcast. Here is, once again, Rick Harper. You mentioned being closely involved in the pre-show of Space Mountain and its installation, and I would love to know what it was like to work directly on that project. What was that like?
It was a great opportunity. It was great fun as well. And working in the model shop was like being in, Magic Land as far as I was concerned. And all these wonderful talents there. And of course, Claude Coates, I think I mentioned in the last interview, he kind of took me under his wing. He got me involved with the Space Mountain pre-show, and eventually, for interesting reasons, he got me involved with the pre-show design. Claude actually had a condition in one eye where he couldn't see. It may have been a cataract or some other kind of problem, and he didn't mention it to anyone, including his family. But I noticed the way he had to kind of move and position himself in order to reach out and grab something like a pencil out of a desk drawer, or adjust his desk lamp. He had to move back and forth the way people do when they can only see through one eye, because they can't quite perceive the three dimension of how far or close something is. Well, that pre-show involved a 3D effect that I could get way too technical describing how that worked, but Claude it became very evident to me that he was having a lot of trouble with it, but he wouldn't talk about it. Claude was a very positive individual. It may have been because this eye condition was coming on kind of slowly, and he reached a point where it was, he was kind of in that, where it was just blurry, not necessarily completely blind in that eye, but 3D was a big issue. So I noticed this, and I started helping him with achieving the 3D effect, which was complicated in how the objects had to be built and placed and lit so that the 3D effect would be maximum. And they were caused by a giant curved hemisphere that were placed behind the windows of that Space Mountain pre-show. You may be aware, I don't know what's there now, but what was there at the time were about 8 trapezoidal windows that, as you were carried up on a moving sidewalk, so to speak, a moving ramp, these objects would appear to be floating by you, and you'd go to reach, and your hand would pass right through them. It was a pretty good effect. So I got so involved with that he essentially just handed the design over to me, and I worked under his supervision, which was, of course, a wonderful experience. And so he and John Hansch and Marty made the decision to send me off to Florida to do the installation, which was an amazing experience at the time. Now, you remember it opened in 75, I believe, down there.
Yeah.
So I went down there in late 73, I think, and I was there for several months working on this technical challenge, and it was a real challenge working with the construction crew, because I looked like the California surfer kid that was still in my teens. And I mentioned to you, I believe, at one point before that I was famous for looking like a 15-year-old surfer. So I show up, and here are these crusty, construction guys that were trying to drag the job out, because they had been working on this thing for a long time, and many of these people had been working on stuff here and there ever since the beginning of the construction of Disney World. So they'd been at it for years, and they saw the end of the money. For them, they saw the end was near with this job. Nothing was lined up immediately after it, so they were trying to drag this job out. So they saw me, and they said, we can manipulate the situation. So it just drove me crazy. And along with the attitude of, who is this guy, and why, who's he, So it took a while to win them over. I did in a few ways, but they kept working on me. So I got together with a couple of other people that were down there. Marty Klein was down there working on the post-show installation, and there were several of us from WED down there working on different aspects of getting Space Mountain pulled together. So we found that the best way to handle these guys that were slowing everything down was just tell them everything looked great. Lighting, for example, as I mentioned before, was extremely important on this pre-show to get the maximum 3D effect out of it. And so I had these very specific positions for the light and all of that, for the different little lights, which were, by the way, the old incandescent Mole-Richardson theatrical lights, which were extremely hot, by the way, to handle. So I'd tell them, okay, well, move. Okay, now set it there. Good, good, good. Now tilt it up, maybe 20 degrees, and they would tilt it 90 degrees. And I go, oh, no, come back a little bit. And they'd they'd overdo everything or underdo everything, so that you had to you give more and more and more, and they drag the job out minute by minute by minute. So I finally got to the point where I go, yeah, tilt it up a little bit. Oh yeah, great, perfect. All right, yeah, just tack that down with. Oh no, you don't need 6 screws. Just use 1. That's fine. And and then we'd go on to the next thing. So then, after working a 12-hour shift doing that, couple of us from WED would go grab a dinner and then sneak back in at night and move everything in its correct position and put in the other attachments to secure everything and move on. And it got more and more frantic as the deadline was getting closer, where we working, and we all got so exhausted. But that was how we got that accomplished. A fun occurrence during it, one of the ways I got, stress relief from all this pressure down there, was they were testing the ride vehicles. And I got to know the crew that was doing that pretty well. And they were putting sandbags in there to, simulate the weight of the guests that would otherwise be riding these. And they were just sending these things round and round and round and round. They were testing on and on and on and on. So during the lunch break, I would go there and I'd ask them to just let one of the vehicles, let me get into one of the vehicles in the load area, pull the sandbags out. I'd sit in there and I would just ride around and around for 30 minutes, just over and over and over again. It was the perfect stress reliever.
That sounds really fun.
It was.
I'm a little jealous, especially early on. I mean, to be able to do that, and also probably too, it's just like reinforces that you're working on something so cool that you get to enjoy it rather than just see the difficult part of it. But
yeah, that's true. I rode that, by the way, when it was just near opening. I rode that ride in an interesting, it just kind of fell in my lap, this situation. I rode it with John Hench, Ron Miller, and Edna Disney, Roy's wife.
Wow.
And yeah, she was like 83 or something at that time. And Ron is going, Edna, you sure you want to ride that? And her answer was, oh, this can't be any worse than those Coney Island rides. So she made it through, and we helped her out, and out of the thing, and she kind of had to get her sea legs back, and she was fine. She had a smile on her face.
that's great. Well, you mentioned John Hench. I mean, he's masterful designer. I love his book. He wrote a book, Design Disney, but so many things he's done for Imagineering, especially in Disney World. Like, could you talk a bit about what it was like to kind of work with him or interact with him?
Yeah, he was just, of course, one of my childhood heroes, and getting to know him was just really a fun time and an honor, because he was so talented, and he had this very dry sense of humor and wit. I mean, he was an intellectual for sure, and he liked being perceived as that. And he earned his he earned his medal for that. And we became very close. And I don't know. I have my theories about why, but I think it was just one of those things where we connected really well, and it was fun. Oh gosh, there's so many funny experiences with him. But I traveled with him quite a bit during some of the research trips involving EPCOT, and we were, a handful of us would go to different companies and wanted to kind of, present basic ideas and kind of see where they're at for, get a little bit of feedback and try to generate interest in sponsorship. So there were a lot of concepts worked up and presentations made that we'd make, and sometimes it would be just for research. For example, one of the trips involved going to Johns Hopkins university where there's a lot of very important medical research that goes on. And we spent several days interviewing some of these people that were on the forefront of the cutting edge discoveries and research that was being done at the time. And so there was one interest that is really burns in a memory in my mind of John and I were sitting together there, and there were a couple of younger ones of us. It was mostly, by the way, it would have been let's see, Marty. Randy Bright was one of the younger ones. Let's see, Claude was there, I believe, and Atencio may have been there. It was, a number of these people that had all this background at Disney, and so we're all sitting there taking notes. And it got to be a little mind-boggling, like being in a college class that's over your head, and the lectures go on, and you're just kind of going, oh my gosh, how much can I take? So John and I were scribbling notes down, but we started drawing caricatures of the people that were doing the presentation, that we were during the question and answer session, while other people were asking questions. We started drawing portraits that, as the hours went on, the portraits became more like caricatures, and we would kind of tip our pads toward the other one to kind of share it, and we'd each kind of nod, with kind of oh yes, that's an important note you made there and whatnot. Well, pretty soon, one of the guys that had been there for most of the meetings, a representative that was there, because there were people coming in and out doing, talking. Some talk for 30 minutes, some talk for, an hour and a half. But this fellow had been there a while, and he just suddenly blurts out, "Can I see your notes?" and he's talking to John and me. It's real clear. We both kind of, John and I look at each other, and we kind of, we're, oh yeah. So we're trying to page backwards, to where we had only writing. And the guy gets up and he goes, no. I'm talking about the drawings. Oh my gosh. I thought I'd have a heart attack. John played it cool, which he was very good at doing. And Marty came to our rescue. The guy came over and he just, he took the pad right out of, one of our hands. And he, we're just sitting there waiting for, some kind of consequence to come down. And Marty said, well, you have to understand, these are Imagineers. And Imagineers, they have free-flowing ideas, and sometimes it kind of, sometimes it's kind of in the zone, sometimes it's kind of out of the boundaries, and I that's part of my job is I try to kind of corral them into the right thinking, and sometimes I have to use a whip. Well, that resulted in a nervous laugh on the part of everybody, and we went on and we were fine, and my heart started beating again, I'm happy to say.
Oh my gosh, that's great. It reminds me, like being in college when you're like not totally paying attention and you get called on by the professor, but this is like in a totally different setting.
Yes, right. It's kind of like, you want to share that with the class? It's like, oh man.
No, I'm good. Thank you. Well, speaking of Marty Sklar, I mean,
yes.
I've read his books. He's done so many interviews, but I'd love to know, beyond him cracking the whip a few times, like, what is your experience like with him working together with Marty when you were at Imagineering?
Well, a total delight. I mean, he was so great to work with. He was reasonable. He was a very good manager of the zoo. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah.
And, that was really his thing, was he would kind of corral thinking, and he's very open. For example, when I wanted to go about the French film in a completely different way from other Circle Vision films, he got on board pretty quickly and was extremely supportive through the whole project. But also, he was personal. And, for example, when Anne and I had our first child, he sent this great letter that was kind of silly and kind of fun, and just a way of saying, hey, baby Harper, behave, please. We've got a lot for your father to do here, so make life easy on him, or something like. It was something of that order. He would do things like that. He went out of his way to make a personal touch, And another example is when I applied for a loan for our first home, for Anne and my first home, he offered and followed through with writing a letter to the loan officer because the issue was, I mean, being in the entertainment business on any level, at least at that point, with the banks was a risk. And because I was pretty young, it was a first home situation. It actually was interesting because the loan officer, her husband was in the movie business, and she understood. She said, these loans are kind of hard to get through. So I said, well, I could probably get some letters written that would, demonstrate a secure future. And she said, great, do it. Well, Marty was quick to do that and wrote a great letter to her, and that took care of the whole thing. So that's typical of him. He even wrote a letter for me long after I'd left Disney and I was getting involved with another project. He even wrote a letter for me that was all this, it was like a recommendation letter on Disney letterhead to the person that I was making the presentation to. So he's with another company entirely. So he would do things like that. He was quite something.
The amount of people that I think have similar experiences with him there's so many. He just seems like an amazing person. And, it's great to hear that he was like that in person too. Not because he was such a public face of Disney in a lot of ways, especially, in the past 20 years or so, or, after Walt passed. So to see that he was that way behind the scenes is awesome. So on a completely different note, I know that you mentioned when you worked on Spaceship Earth, you did some work with Gordon Cooper, the astronaut. So I would love to hear if you have any stories of Gordon Cooper, who was one of the Mercury astronauts, and being involved with that.
Yes, and he also flew a Gemini flight as well. Yeah, he was interesting. He was brought in to help. There were a couple of people brought in to really help Disney shift their image from Mickey Mouse cartoons. Most of the public thought of them that way, and of course the wonderful animated films, Mickey Mouse Club, and Disneyland. He and Ray Bradbury were brought in to help be an appealing image to the corporate world. Having those two people who were so well known and associated with technology and the future and future thinking and all that kind of stuff, which was what EPCOT was supposed to be all about, it helped kind of set the tone for Disney going in that direction. And it gave validity. It offered validity to that. And so both of them were very, amusing people in very different ways. Gordon just had, you could see, I remember the first meeting where I was in the room with him, and there were, I had done some concept work on Spaceship Earth and some other things, and it was in those years, like around right after Space Mountain installation was done. When I got back, I was suddenly moved into design work instead of the model shop, and I was invited to all these meetings. So when Gordon Cooper came in, there were maybe 10 of us in the room, and we're all just asking him questions about his experiences. And we learned right then and there that he was very congenial, very easy to get along with, had a wild streak. For example, he had told us about how, the space food was so terrible. He had, during the training periods, he smuggled a ham sandwich in his spacesuit. And it really got him in trouble. It screwed up all the, blood sugar recordings and all the other stuff they were doing, on the flight. He had some other rather earthy stories about the goings-on and being in the Gemini flight for basically 8 days. So he was a character. Traveling with him, so it was a lot of fun. We went to there were three locations that we went to primarily with him that I recall. The Johnson Space Center, the Kennedy Space Center, is that right? There's one in Texas and one in Florida, and I get mixed up who's who.
I think you got it right. Yeah, Florida is Johnson, and then or Florida is Kennedy, and Texas is Johnson. Yeah.
Oh, that's right. Of course.
Yeah.
That adds up. Okay, so we went to those space centers as well as to the Smithsonian, which at the time had a display of both a Mercury capsule and the Gemini capsule. And I'll tell you, when I saw those things, and I just could not believe how small they were. Both of them. And the Mercury one was small, but the Gemini one and fitting two people in there for 8 days. Mercury was, I forget, it was what, maybe a 20-hour flight. I forget what it was. And but the other one I know went nearly 8 days. And plus, when you think of the technology of the era and the risk level involved, it's just totally amazing what this guy did. But meeting him, you'd never know he was this, hero that we all thought of him as. He was very, very easy to get along with, and of course he had an in, to say the least, in all of these places. So that was fun to see. We had free reign to see whatever we wanted, and of course saw some very interesting things related to the training and all of that kind of stuff.
I can imagine when you're one of the original astronauts, and you probably don't get told no a lot when you're going around those areas. I would think that has to be really fun, but it's great to hear about him, because I'm more familiar with like him as Dennis Quaid in The Right Stuff, or him on like various like fictional things, not the actual guy. So that's really interesting. So that's a fascinating story. So another thing I wanted to know about is, you referenced this right before we started, which I know nothing about, is you were involved with working on an idea for an Arab pavilion with Harper Goff. And I'm really curious about this because it's not something we hear about very often.
Yes, Harper was one of those people. I'll kind of start with him in general. He was one of those childhood idols of mine, largely because of his work on 20,000 Leagues. And I was fascinated by his stories about how they were filming some of those miniatures, the effect shots, which involved anamorphic lenses, which it's amazing what this guy, he was so practical, this man. He could look at a problem and go about it both creatively and very practically. So, a good example is on the World Showcase pavilions. At the time that he came in, the pavilion designs were all on the different structures, much like a World's Fair would have been, where they're all totally different structures. And he came in and he took a look at the situation and said, you know what, we need to redesign the big picture here. And he came up with the kind of pie-shaped, I'll say truncated pie shapes, like the slim end of it, cut off. All those pavilions basically have that shape structurally, and that saved just megabucks going about it that way. And then, of course, the facades are all designed very differently, and so most guests are not aware that there is this common structural design to each one of them, or to all of them. So he saved gobs and gobs of money with that. So I got to know him a bit on that, and also just connecting with him about I loved hearing his stories about, the films he'd worked on. He had done a film for Stanley Kubrick, where he told some really interesting stories about how he went about things. He's very good at saving people money in these projects, and not only doing that, but simultaneously coming up with something better visually. And he was a very open human being, a really sensitive individual, and I have a vivid memory of him sharing with me at a point where his wife had gotten very ill. We were in his office together, and he just started talking about her and how much he loved her, and he just broke down and he's sobbing, and it was a very emotional time. But this is something, most people have draw a line in, a social line in that kind of thing, but he was just, he was just real right from the get-go. So that was something about him that was quite amazing. But he also I was floored when he gave me a model of the Nautilus that he had made My understanding was that he'd gotten the old plans out, and he worked with Tom Sherman, I think was his name. Tom Sherman was in the model shop, and he really had an obsession about the whole Captain Nemo thing. The whole 20,000 liter. He had an apartment, in fact, that he had converted by putting a ship's ladder between the top and bottom floors, and the whole place looked like the inside of the Nautilus. It was anyway, so he was something. Anyway, he and Tom Sherman worked on getting these models made, and then Harper gave them to various people, and I was just floored when he gave me one. I still have it, and I love it completely. So on the Arab Pavilion, in World Showcase, there was originally going to be a Middle East pavilion, then it was going to be an Arab pavilion, then it was going to be a United Emirates pavilion, and it eventually morphed into the Moroccan pavilion. So that's kind of how things would go on these projects. But in the stage where it was going to be the Arab pavilion, I was assigned as the designer on it and on the ride itself. And so it was like all of the World Showcase pavilions. We wanted to romanticize, the country. Much the way the French film does. We didn't want to show the industry side. We wanted to show the appealing part of what it would be like to be there and experience the place. So I worked with a writer named Gary Goddard at the time, who was also brought on as a writer, and we worked together on coming up with a magic carpet ride concept. And then I did a bunch of illustrations for that. Also working out the ride pathway and that kind of thing. And I believe at one point I sought Claude's advice on some of that. But the presentation part, we went to Washington, D.C., where there was a fellow named Lang Washburn who had experience with, in the diplomatic world and whatnot. And Disney had hired him to set up an office in Washington, D.C., and we did a bunch of presentations to various Arab ambassadors that came in, and generally things went pretty well. But as usual, the issue of, well, gee, we want to show our industry. We want to, and all of the pavilions went through that. So there was always this awkward time of trying to find a meeting place between those two needs. So we worked those things out, and the United Emirates in particular, they stepped forward, and they were very interested in it. So we set up a presentation in their embassy, which was just outside of D.C. in Maryland. And it was a fantastic environment to walk into. It looked like, the Alhambra Palace. It was incredible inside with all this inlaid mirror and arabesques and, all this amazing stuff. And quite an experience. And we set up in there. Jim Elliott was with us with this big model of EPCOT, and there were about 25 or 30 ambassadors showed up and did this presentation. And the presentation involved a movie that had been made that I had not seen the most recent version of it. And so in running it, let me back up. All right. I thought I better view this thing just so I know what's there. So while Jim Elliott is setting things up and a couple others, I view the film, and here comes a Court of Flags scene, and it has a panoramic going across the Court of Flags, and it's just an illustration that Colin Campbell had done. And among the flags, it's France, Germany, it's all these Europeans, the American flag, and here comes the Israeli flag.
Oh, no.
And the ambassador went berserk. He said, "This is, you've defiled my home. Get out of here," basically is what he said. I'm calling it all off. And this is when, 40 minutes later, everybody's supposed to show up. So he went storming down the hall. He was really, really upset. And Lang Washburn goes running after him and somehow managed to patch things up. And they come back together, and So I said to him, he said, we can go ahead with the presentation. I said, well, what about the movie? Is that going to be an issue? And he said, I'll explain things if I have to. He said, well, just go ahead with it. So total Lang earned his money, in that discussion, whatever he did. Well, in the meantime, while they were back there and after the initial blow up of this guy, I called Orlando Ferrane. I said, hey, have you seen the latest version of this? There's this shot, and I explained to him what had happened, and he said, oh, Rick, you got to just explain to these guys, this whole World Showcase thing is a brotherly love thing. And I said, well, Orlando, I'll have to tell you the whole story when I get back, but thanks for your advice. We'll see how things go. Anyway, things went well ultimately, and we got some strong interest from the United Emirates, and that particular guy asked me. We're at the end, there's all this discussion. We're all standing around and yakety-yakking. And this guy comes up to the model. I was near the model. There was a specific model of that magic carpet ride and the entry court to the whole pavilion and all that stuff. So he's looking and he said, tell me, what would this cost? And I'm thinking, I just answered the standard, we're putting that together, and give me your contact, and we'll let you know, kind of thing. And he said, no, really, you must have some idea, or you wouldn't be here. And I said, well, just off the top of my head, Space Mountain was about 30 million or something like that. I think it's probably in that zone. It's probably about the same thing. Well, oh my gosh. Then I got this horrible feeling afterwards, like, oh man, I'm going to be fired for sure. This is like a really stupid thing I did. And of course, Marty just hit the ceiling when I got back. I confessed it to him when I got back, and he went, oh, don't ever. You have no idea what a mess you've made, and that kind of thing. And so, golly, I can't think of the guy's name that headed up the budget department. He was actually kind of amused. And he said, well, yeah, I can pull something together. And I forget how many weeks he worked on it. He came up with a range, which actually I had told the guy. I had told the ambassador, I'd said, well, somewhere maybe between 25, 30 million, something like that. I mean, don't quote me, but, and of course, anyway, so back to WED later on, the guy works on the budget, and he came up with the exact same thing that I told the guy. And working the numbers. And, it was one of the few times Marty really got angry with me. So I needled him about it. I went, when this came out, I said, hey, Marty, I could save you guys a ton of money. Just let me know when you need something off the top of my head.
That's really funny. Yeah. I mean, you could be like, give some really broad range, but I'm glad it didn't end up being that big of a deal, because that would not be good.
Man, no kidding.
All right. Well, I wanted to ask you about a couple more people that you worked with. One is Ward Kimball, who I know just was involved in so many interesting things at Disney, and I'd love to know what your experience was like with Ward.
Well, he certainly earned his reputation as a wacky, fun person. That's for sure. My initial exposure to him was actually doing a film with him, and there was a fellow at WED that had contact information with a magazine that specialized in model railroading, and I was doing all these outside film projects. This is in the early to mid 70s. I was doing all these outside film projects. So this fellow, his name was Mike O'Connell. He learned about my film stuff, and he said, hey, I got this magazine that I think I can talk them into doing a movie about model railroading. They're trying to expand their, the hobby into a younger audience. So I went, heck yeah, that'd be fun. So one of the first things we did was we got Ward Kimball involved, and he was involved in two ways. He kind of introduces the film in the beginning. He had that we shot in a kind of a little train telegraph, station room that he had on his property there. It was out in Atherton area, if I remember right. So he he hosted that, and he was a little nervous on screen, but he came through, and it was a lot of fun working with him to do that. But also, he had these full-size train engines. He had a couple of, and a couple of boxcars and things like this that were in this huge, warehouse that the tracks led into, and he could pull them out. So we wound up designing and doing a kind of a Busby Berkeley musical sequence with dancing girls as part of that film. So he was very much involved with that too. So that was my initial getting to know him. But as the 70s carried along, that film was, I think, in 73 that we did that. And then in the months that followed, he was coming into WED now and then to work on a few things, and I got to know him further when we were kind of sharing an office space, which was actually really a conference room that was right off of Randy Bright's office, right next to it. And Randy used it for meetings, and that whole kind of area would use it for meetings. But Ward and I were in there working on two different things. So we started, just having some fun things going on. For example, we began a series of tests on which type of cookie had the most grease, that were the cookies that were offered in the cafeteria there at WED. And by we'd pin part of the cookie on a sheet of paper on the storyboard wall. And then we'd let these things sit for days and weeks and see how much grease would spread out from the cookie. And then we'd mark it what the dates were. It was like, marking the rings on a sawed redwood tree, where you're marking the years and what the history was at that point in time. And it was marking it that way. So that was kind of a silly thing going on in the room. He also gave me a model sheet, an updated Mickey Mouse model sheet, which is absolutely hilarious, where he updates different types of Mickeys that might be utilized in future Disney films. An old Mickey, a hippie Mickey, these different things. There were about 8 of them. They're really very silly. So he was a fun guy. And I also visited him a couple of times in his home out there, and he had not only train collections, I mean, an unbelievable collection of toy trains from different eras. And so he had a whole different warehouse out there devoted to that. And part of that, he was starting to collect. Now, this would have been, maybe right around the 80s, somewhere in the early 80s. He was starting to collect the Japanese toy robots. He had an incredible collection of these things. And this was before, since then, those things are like crazy at auctions. They're crazy expensive. He managed to get on the front end of that wave of collecting as well. So he was multifaceted. We also had a lot of discussions about art, it goes for every single Imagineer I worked with and knew. I'd always get in discussions about art because I'm always interested in who the influences are, and I have just a lot of interest in various artistic styles and approaches. And we discovered that we both were crazy about this artist named Ronald Searle. And if you look him up on the internet, you'll discover some really wacky drawings. And Ward was very influenced by this man. And in fact, even Walt invited Searle to the studio because there were a few animators that had gotten, that took quite an interest in his work. He is out there wacky, and you can get a feel by seeing some of Ronald Searle's work. You can get a feel for the influence it had on Ward in films like Toot Whistle, Plunk and Boom, and some of those kind of groundbreaking different approaches that were taken by Ward. You can also get an idea about the Mad Hatter scene in Alice of Wonderland. Certainly appears to be influenced by Ronald Searle as well. And we talked about even artists, I was a big fan of Mad Magazine artists that during the 60s in particular, early to, mid to late 60s, there were some incredible artists for that magazine, and we discovered that we both love many of those artists. And he developed a later interest in, are you ready? Norman Rockwell. You would not expect that from wacky Ward Kimball, but he developed a real admiration for the guy, and it was because he had finally seen some originals. The originals are mind-blowing. They're very free brushwork and beautiful layered coloring. I mean, you'd never when these large paintings that Rockwell did for the Post, when they were reduced in size for the magazine cover, you lost all of that. And so Ward, that was a great awakening for Ward to make that discovery. And so he was an interesting guy. He had many facets, and of course the Firehouse Five.
Yeah.
There's another aspect to him. And I had not realized until I talked to him about it that later on, this was in the later 80s, I didn't realize that Harper Goff had been a member of that. He was part of the Firehouse 5+2.
I was thinking, I'm like, we're just doing we're covering multiple people from the Firehouse 5 here. So when we talked about Harper, so it's we're just on top of it.
Mm-hmm.
Now we'll continue. Now there's so many great stories, and I love hearing about people like Ward Kimball that had so many interests and were involved for so long. So I want to make sure we get a chance to talk a bit more about Impressions to France. But I think the last person I want to ask you about kind of fits with that, which is Don Iwerks, who I know had so many important contributions just to innovations with film and how it was done. So I'd love to hear about, you working with Don, and then possibly how something with Impressions to France too for him.
Well, he was, oh man, he like descended from the sky at the right time, because in getting the concept sold of doing the French film differently from other Circle Vision films, I really wanted to break the mold, on some of the entrenched ways of doing Circle Vision technically. And the tilt, being able to tilt the system was in my mind, and I have a pretty good head for engineering, but I ain't done. I'm not Don Artworks. Anyway, I kept thinking, man, this is a 550-pound camera system. You try to put that on a gearhead, it's going to be top heavy, and how on earth are you ever going to be able to do that? And so when I asked Don, I said, is there any way? I really want to do some tilt up, tilt down. I want to be able to tilt the cameras anyway. And he instantly said, well, if I have to double check where the center of gravity axis would be on that, but I think we might get lucky and just be able to build a cradle that it would work. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh! And what the axis, won't that have to run right through the middle of the camera? I go, no, it's you build around that. And he basically built this thing, and I mean, he invented it instantly, and then it was built pretty quickly after that. That was, if you can picture a baby cradle, and that the axis invisibly goes through the center of gravity, but on the outside of where the actual baby seat is, are two axes that become a cradle back and forth. It's a little bit like, a kid on a swing doesn't have an axis running through them. So anyway, he built that, and it worked incredibly. I could tilt this thing with complete ease during a shot, and it was an amazing device. Well, wound up using that on many locations, and also would use it periodically for just on a dolly shot or on the camera card, just to either easily position the camera or to actually do a slight tilt during that, or like in a case of the rare grab shots that we did, it would be helpful in just setting it up quickly. By the way, we did do grab shots on that film.
the way that the feeling of movement and just the way that film seems, I mean, it's just, you can tell that there were some inventive devices used, because a lot of films, even from that time, are very static and very, and the way that you're on helicopters and we're flying by the water and we're riding cars and stuff. I mean, I watched that and I'm like, I constantly am thinking, how was this done? Because we talked about it a bit the last time with the Eiffel Tower scene, but there are so many moments where I think, wait, they had a big camera? I don't understand. So it's you can tell there's some innovation there for sure.
Well, he came to the rescue again on the whole helicopter thing. I mean, that was the other big breakthrough I was hoping to do. And believe me, it was, I mean, he just, the thing about Don is nothing phases him. He just goes, he thinks about it and he just forges the way. And I don't remember one, honestly, in those years, I just don't remember anything phasing him. And things got really difficult on developing that helicopter mount over a period of months. It was full of challenges. I mean, the problems of how you're going to land the helicopter. You got this big thing hanging underneath it. Had to develop tables that it could land on, and the camera would have to be hovered down slowly by our magnificent pilot, Mark Wolf, very carefully down there. And tables only allowed for about maybe 8 inches on either side of that camera system. I mean, but we knew we had to have a great pilot, and that counted. And also, he came up with the best vibration detection system that we could do at the time, and that was a great help, because I had to be very aware of if these look like a little echocardiogram readout on paper, by the way. No digital imaging here, and so I had to be very aware of those while we were filming. If that chart ever got beyond a certain point that we had established, it would be too much vibration. So so allowing for that kind of filming benefited the movie incredibly. So I was very, very. I am so grateful to Don for his contribution to that movie, which opened the way, because we were the first of the movies to go into production. It opened the doors for the other Circle Vision films and the other large format films to utilize a helicopter mount.
Yeah, it makes a big difference, because
incredible. Yeah,
you're not doing Circle Vision, I think you described last time, a lot of it was early on, you were kind of just putting things on cars and driving them, where now, you can put it up in the air and float around. It's just it's a different, totally different. But you mentioned vibrations too. I think about scenes like the car racing scene at Cannes, or even the market scene, and those things where you're we're moving along. Was that a real challenge for either of those to really keep it from, getting too unsteady, I guess, in a way?
Always. And, the wonderful French crew that we had, just fantastic people, headed up by a man named René Stresser. And by the way, there were total of 5, that were involved with the crew one way or another. They were a family that had done a lot of American productions over there, like Charade and some other films like that. But, none of them really spoke English. So I always had my drawing pad with me, because I only knew, I don't know, very little French, and probably pronounced it terribly. So, but drawing seemed to get me by. But they were really behind this film, and they were so great at looking out for those important things. In the market scene, it was a pretty complicated setup, because I asked René if he could build. This was attached to the dolly itself, which wasn't all that large. Around the camera, he built a platform just out of sight of the cameras on the front, so that we could set all those flowers around the front of the camera. And it added a lot of color and interest, and it also gave some interaction between the there's a woman and a young lady that are kind of pulling the cart and opening a shot, and then they stop the cart and they pick up some of the flowers and they delivered them to various people around, at the different areas. And the big thing that was always a challenge was those dividers between the screens that I didn't want somebody's face, winding up there. I didn't want some sign or some written thing to suddenly spell a different word or as, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I had to be really careful in setting up these shots. And so that scene, basically, we hired the whole village. We found a great little village in Normandy called Bouvron, and we just basically hired the village to set up their usual market, and everybody was directed very specifically in that. We were dodging cloudy weather during the shooting day, and it drove us all nuts, so we had to keep repositioning and starting all over and trying to anticipate when the sun would break through and if it would last long enough, because we had very little breakthroughs of sunlight, so we had to do quite a number of takes to get that shot. But it finally worked out.
Yeah, the choreography of that and just the setup, even for none of the shots are super long, but for a shot like that, it's a little mind-boggling to me that you were able to pull that together, because it's just, there's a lot of, like you mentioned, so many different elements, plus it has to look good and work. I'm really impressed by it.
Well, thank you. One of the tricky things was during shooting, there was no way to actually see what was on those screens. And there was no way to actually see where those dividers, if somebody was going to stop on the wrong spot, So what I had to do was kind of mark. I'd have visual markers out within the field. I go, okay, well that particular potted plant, I'm going to position that on one spot, so I know that just to the left of it is where the divider is going to be. And I have to. And in a moving shot, it got very complicated. So I had to get behind the camera and try to make my best judgment about are we having a problem with that or are we not on the moving shots, on like the balloon liftoff, oh heavens, and the market scene and that kind of thing.
So for Impressions de France, did you have any type of video assist or any way you could at least have some guidance when you were shooting some of the more complicated shots?
So on that black and white video assist, it was a little screen that was maybe 3 inches by 4 inches, and I could mark on that with a grease pencil an approximation of the front camera. I could see that while we were filming, and the wires ran, and it was, the camera was placed on top of or above the Circle Vision camera. So it was an approximation, but it was helpful in at least trying to get in the front camera, trying to avoid those divides, when we're flying along there, and I wanted to have this certain, for example, the bell tower in Vézelay, that when we fly up to it, I wanted to be sure that was in the center screen. And so it was helpful. But viewing that with one eyeball and the other eyeball double checking the vibration detector constantly, and then giving constant verbal direction to Mark. We weren't just flying randomly. There were very specific directions as to, okay, we want to keep this. All right, now we want to veer to the right 30 degrees. Okay, now tilt up as you fly over this. Oh, but keep that center frame on its own. Yep. All right, now we're gonna go left a little bit. It was a constant thing, and Mark was so great about being able to do virtually anything with that helicopter. An example is, you may recall the shot of the skiers in the Alps there. We're following them along, and we are, at times, the camera's only maybe 8 feet off the ground. And they're initially in the center screen, but as we move up closer to them, and they're skiing along there on that side of that slope, I asked Mark to fly a little bit sideways at about a 45-degree angle. He's still flying forward, in the direction that the skiers are going, but I wanted to now see them in profile as we're going by them. And while he's doing this, he's having to fly underneath 2 ski lift cables, which, by the way, we only got one chance at this for that reason, and then correct the flight more to flying straight as we continue on. And these very specific and he also had to tilt during part of it to keep them in frame. So he was really something, and having a video assist definitely helped in those situations.
So summarizing on Impressions of France, one thing that interests me too, because I think it holds up so well, is technology, like we've talked about, has changed a lot over the years. So I'd love to know for you, just what are some ways that it's changed a lot that would have made shooting a lot different for you if you had that technology?
Well, the Mitchell cameras, which were used on that, they date way back to Edison technology, and the lenses, date back to probably the 1940s and this kind of thing. So, and there's no viewfinder when you're shooting, that you can see all 5 cameras. So that was tremendously limiting. Then, of course, the sheer weight of it. Well, we all know that in the digital realm, you can get very high resolution with these extremely lightweight systems, and you can see it immediately and just right there. And you're not going through chemical soup that can ruin the color timing of the film and the kinds of things that were issues especially with shooting with a 5 camera system. So it's, you're not dealing with sprocketed film, and you're not dealing with having to go through internegatives and then interpositives and then your final print, which creates a contrast issues along the way with film technology. So the digital realm has opened up so much, and therefore, and also the lightweight nature of it. Secondly, we were using for lighting incandescent lighting. By the way, I would bring along my own lighting kits that I'd purchased and collected over the years, and I had several cases of lighting equipment, and Joe Nash would pack this stuff up along with everything else when we were shooting the American Journeys or even the Magic Carpet films overseas, and even the French film. I had my own lighting equipment with me, in addition to what we would use that was available locally, sometimes, which was extremely iffy. Anyway, so with LED lighting, you have this amazing, again, lightweight. It's cool, so you're not dealing with all the heavy containers that the lighting has to be on. So again, it reduces weight. The other thing about digital, you can shoot in such low light. You can use a couple flashlights and ambient light coming through a window and make something very beautiful out of it. Whereas before you had to build that up with a lot of light. Oh, that was the other thing about using film. You're dealing with film speeds that were very limiting. Now, I'm not talking about the speed that the film runs through the camera, but what was known as how light sensitive it was. And often I was using ASA 25, which was the slowest film speed, because I wanted to get the warmth out of it. It was their Kodacolor Kodak's best film in terms of low contrast and achieving warmth in a scene. So I would use that film. Oh, that also would result in my having to sometimes undercrank the film, which meant, for example, the tilt-down shot in Vézelay inside in that church, I had to shoot that at 6 frames per second, not the standard 24 frames per second. I had to shoot it at 6 frames per second in order to get enough light onto the film through the lens. The lens was I think it was a 3.5 f-stop. So that was kind of limiting in itself too. So today you could do that. You could do that without lighting it at all. It would look great. So these breakthroughs. Oh, and of course the drones. That's a huge one right there. I mean, you could get so many amazing things with the drones that wouldn't involve the daring do that we had to go through a few times.
It's almost too easy now. I think you had to go through a lot, but I think the results are spectacular. I mean, they still stand up so well, and I'm glad that people still get to see it in some capacity. It's great. Well, I want to ask you about something totally different, Rick, which is the speed tunnel at Disneyland. We talked a little bit about it last time. I love speed tunnels and how they can simulate motion, but I know you had kind of an interesting experience while shooting in the Everglades, unfortunately, and I would love to hear a little bit about that.
Well, yes. In general, shooting that film always involves some riskiness because we were having vehicles or boats headed straight toward us and then veering off at the last minute. And this is while we're moving on a camera car or on a boat toward those vehicles that are coming toward us. So there was some very much some riskiness involved with that. So in the Everglades, it got even trickier because these boats, the Everglade boats, as you are probably aware, they involve these huge airplane propellers on the back of them, and the boats themselves are kind of like skiffs and flatboats, and with these big propellers on them, when those propellers are fired up, these things go charging forth, not with a lot of control to them. So we had, I don't know, I forget, maybe six boats, 6 or 8 boats, and we had a camera boat, which was also a one of those Everglade boats. I knew on these shots I had to rehearse scenes very carefully, very slowly at first, so people got an idea of the dangers and critical nature of closing speeds. That is, the speed that we're, the combined speed of them coming toward us and us going toward them and then veering at the last minute. It's a hard thing to judge, and even for stunt drivers. And we weren't working with stunt drivers. we were working with drunk drivers because they were a happy bunch, and during in between our different rehearsals, they'd all have another round of beer, and I was getting pretty concerned about that along the way. So anyway, we get set and we're doing a take, and things are looking pretty good, and then I can see that along about maybe the 4th boat was not judging that speed correctly, and Art Cruikshank was to my right. The camera was between us, in front of us a little bit. We're in the front of the boat. And by the way, on that project, Art was the cinematographer. And Joe Nass was with us too on that as a camera technician. Anyway, so Art and I are in the front, and then behind us there's Joe, the driver of the boat, and a local contact. So this thing is not, and Art and I can see right away, oh my gosh, this thing is going to hit us. And, this is all in a split second. Art turns and tries to leap over the back seat. He kind of gets mostly over it. Same with me. We're doing the same thing, but the propeller of that boat, he's sliding, trying to veer, so he kind of slides into us at a 45-degree angle, and therefore the propeller lodges in the front of the boat, misses the camera, lodges in the front of the boat, and snaps into a zillion pieces, and all the shrapnel is going everywhere. And Art, I was extremely concerned about Art, and he was fine. He wasn't hit, but I was hit in the rear end, and oh my gosh, it felt like, it was extremely painful. I thought, what happened here? Anyway, it turned out to be a very large bruise. It took months to go away, but when that was of course later on learning all of that. But when we so we returned to the dock. The guy is all upset, whose boat hit us, and he's extremely upset. So I got our production manager, Bill Schneider. I just said, whatever this guy wants, pay it. And so he handled that very well. And next thing you know, all the boat owners are having another round of beer. And, meanwhile, I'm thinking, oh boy, I got to call Art. I got to call Orlando. See, Orlando was on that project also my contact person. I would kind of report to him every day what was going on, where we're going, what kind of success we had, and all of that. And always good natured. He was always fun to talk to. But again, so I call him and I say, Orlando, he's going, well, how'd it go? I said, well, no one was hurt. And he goes, oh my God, what did you do? What did you? So I explained it to him, and he eventually calmed down. But I'm thinking, this is one of those, yet another situation where I'm thinking I'm probably going to be fired. But that didn't materialize, fortunately. And but I was worried because in the ER, somebody called an ambulance and I was whisked away, which I didn't feel was necessary. But I was brought over to a hospital, and while they stick me in a little room there, I'm watching the news, and here we are on the news. Some guy had shown up that had shot a little video report of the whole incident, talking mostly about it. Of course, he didn't have a camera. He wasn't there when it actually happened, and so I'm now worried. Oh my gosh, they're going to see this in California somehow or other. This because it's Disney and it's all. But anyway, it all turned out okay.
Wow. Between this and Impressions to France, I think the life of an Imagineer, and especially a film director, is much more dangerous than I thought, Rick.
Well, when you're crazy, yes.
I think it's part of the job, though. Part of the job description. You got to be a little crazy to do so good, to do so many good things.
I think you're right.
So. Okay, I wanted to ask you briefly. You sent me some art of a Captain Nemo restaurant, which to me, I feel like that looks like something that could totally open today. And I'd love to know a little bit about that concept and how that came together.
Well, that was something I did for Tony, actually, Tony Baxter. We were both and are both big fans of 20,000 Leagues. And so I thought, gosh, it'd be so cool to do a restaurant based on that. And I don't know, I just got this idea. And I first did a little sketch, and I thought, I'm going to do a full-blown thing here. So that was a fun illustration to do. It was really fun. And Tony just loved it. And he would try to sell that thing. He over the years, it was so funny because I did that right around, I'm thinking it was probably right around 1975. I did that, maybe 76, that I did that illustration. And anyway, as the years went on, this illustration would kind of circulate, and I'd walk by this conference room or that conference room, and it was in there, and then it was back in Tony's office, and it was constantly popping up, and I'd check in with Tony and go, "What is this ever going to happen, or what?" He said, "Man, I'm working on it. I keep trying to get this thing sold," and amazingly, I think some version of it, very watered down version of it, occurred, but I'm not even sure of that. I think there was something in one of the parks that's some watered down version, but no pun intended. But anyway, that's the case with that.
I feel like it could have worked in maybe like, I know Tony had a lot of ideas for like a Discovery Bay.
Yes, that is what I did it for initially. I had done a few little sketch ideas for Discovery Bay, and we talked about a Captain Nemo restaurant. I went, oh man, I want to really do a real illustration for this. That is how it came about.
Interesting. Well, I'm just going to ask one more thing. I know we talked about so many people you worked with. One person we haven't mentioned that I know you worked with was Atencio, and Pirates, Haunted Mansion. So so many great things he was involved with. I'd love to hear a little bit about him and what you did when you worked with him.
Well, another dream come true, really, to be right next to him in an office there for a few years, and he. He was quick to give good advice when I asked it, and he was friendly, had a great sense of humor, but every once in a while he could zing you, and it was a real shock. There was a thing where during Space Mountain development, and I think this was when I came. No, it would have been before I went to Florida, actually. X had written some dialogue for some kind of chatter between different commanders on the, whatever the Space Mountain crew was, supposedly. And and some of that stuff is still there. But anyway, he got a group of people together, and I was one of them. And I was asked a lot to do narration and things like that, and I'd always tell people I'm too, my stage fright is ridiculous. I'm not a good narrator, and it would usually prove to be true. And so this this situation involved about six of us reading from a script that X had done. Commander X1242, we need to, eject such and such hatch, and it was all this kind of jargon. And we get a little ways into it, and everybody seems to be doing fine. I think I'm doing fine. And X looks at me and says, "Rick, you're terrible at this." I said, "Well, X, I warned you." He goes, "Oh boy," So we kept going, and much to my surprise, anytime I went on Space Mountain, no matter which park it was in, I always heard myself in there. Ann would point it out to me as well. So I guess he decided differently at that point. He was one to be very generous with his talent in writing. For example, when Ann and I got married, he made this beautiful card that a bunch of the Imagineers signed, and he was really very generous with his time on that kind of thing. And I have several pieces of artwork and cards and original art and that he put in some of my books that I asked him to sign, like the Art of Walt Disney book. He did a couple full-blown illustrations in there that are really wonderful.
That's great to hear. Because I don't know. I mean, a lot of people have like the legendary Imagineers. You hear a lot about what they did on the biggest attractions, but not some of the other stories. So these have been great stories, Rick. I love hearing them.
Thank you.
All right. Well, this has been awesome. I feel like, I could go scene by scene on Impressions to France with you because I love that film so much, but you've given it's such great background. I've loved getting to talk with you again, and thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Well, thank you again for the opportunity. It's a real pleasure talking with you.
Before I close out this episode, I did want to mention that tomorrow is Election Day in the United States. And I'm not here to make a big political speech, but I did feel like I wanted to say a few short things about it here on the podcast. It's been a tough year here in 2020. And, we're in the middle of a pandemic, a lot of other things going on that have been a challenge. The economy here is very rough. And any election or vote is not going to magically change anything. However, please go out there, and if you haven't already voted, many people have voted early. I've done that, or through the mail. Please make your voice heard. If you're able and have the ability, please vote tomorrow. And when you're voting, just remember this. This is not like choosing a sports team. This is not a situation where if you've supported a certain party for your life, your family, or whatnot, that you automatically have to follow that. Really sit back and think about what the world is like right now and what you would like it to be. If after doing that, you support any particular candidate, that's okay. I just want to remind you, this is a theme park podcast, and I even created the name Tomorrow Society kind of on a lark with the idea of my interest in EPCOT Center and all of that. But still, part of the things I think about a lot are, what do I want the world to look like? And what small part do I have in that? So beyond the presidential election, there are a lot of very important propositions and amendments, your local state representatives and senators. Going down the list, some of those choices can make an even bigger impact on your life than just who's the president in general. So please, when you go vote, if you haven't done so already, think about all of that. Do your research. I know many of you probably will be listening to this after this happens, but if you are listening to this on Monday, I just ask you to take it seriously and really take the time. This is so important anytime when we have an election, but especially right now. And I just hope that when you're voting, that you really think through what people have done and hopefully what could happen in the future, because I know it's a very rough time. However, we have to think about ways we can make things better. And a lot of us don't have a lot of say in what happens in institutions and governments and everything. This is one small way that we do have a say. And I just hope you go out there and are taking it seriously. I know many of you are, but if you are wondering whether or not you should go, there may be long lines or everything, just really think about it and try your best to do so. Thanks a lot for listening to my statement about the election, but I feel like not at least mentioning it. I have to try to do what I can to, if you're on the edge, to maybe get you to go out there and do it. And I hope you enjoyed this episode with Rick Harper. If you haven't heard his first appearance on episode 61, it was amazing, especially if you like Impressions of France. You can find that and a lot more at tomorrowsociety.com/podcast with an S at the end. If you'd like to get a hold of me, send me an email, dan@tomorrowsociety.com. You can still get a hold of me with some last-minute questions or comments for the listener Q&A podcast if you submit them within the next day or so. You can also follow me on Twitter at TomorrowSOC, Facebook or Instagram at Tomorrow Society. You can subscribe to the Tomorrow Society Podcast YouTube channel, where I've been posting a lot of cool home videos from trips to EPCOT and other parks in the 1980s and even earlier. I'm also currently working on audio commentary of all the clips from our trip in 1986 that I think it's going to be a lot of fun to put together. TomorrowSociety.com/YouTube. The Tomorrow Society Podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Dan Heaton. The music was written by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Next time is the Listener Q&A podcast, so if you would like me to talk about any topics related to Disney, theme parks, anything even remotely related to that, submit your questions. You have a day or so to do so. Regardless, it's going to be great fun to talk through a lot of the great questions I've already received. Thanks so much for listening. Please go out there and vote. Be safe. Take care of yourself. Wear masks. I'll talk to you again next time.